Okay, so in this tutorial, or in this series, I'm going to walk you through how to make the section perspective rendering. And in this first video, we're just going to talk about how to set up the view and how to set up the render settings. So I'm starting with this digital model. I'm not going to do a video of how to make these models because I'm sure you guys are capable of that at this point. But I just wanted to point out that there's not a ton of detail in this model because we really don't need that for this assignment. So I've modeled a few things like the shade and the kind of the railings in like a more diagrammatic way. And I've modeled like a few of the windows and stuff just where we're going to be looking in the model. But just to keep in mind, you don't need a ton of detail for this drawing, digital model. So what I'm going to do first is set up my section cut. So I want to use the same section cut as I've been doing in the other drawings. So the same one that you'll use in Studio and the same one you'll use in building construction. And I'm going to set my section cut by using the command clipping plane. Now I'm going to use this option vertical, and I want it to be about here, I think. So wherever your section, whatever section cut you chose, that's where you'll place that clipping plane, and you can see it makes a live section through your model. So I positioned where I want it. Okay. And I'm also, so right now I'm already in perspective view, but if you're not already, at this point you would go to the top right, right click on that menu, set view perspective. Now what we want to do here is set up, we have our section cut established in the model, but we also need to set up our view. And in order to do that, we need to set up our view so that we're basically perfectly perpendicular to the section cut plane. Now, in order to do that, what I'm actually going to do is minimize so I can see all the viewports again. A little bit too far there. Hide this stuff for now. And then I'm going to go again in perspective, and I'm going to type in camera. And then I'll hit the option show. And now in my top view here, you can see that this camera object has appeared. We're actually going to use this. You can see when I move it around, it's changing my view in my perspective viewport. So we're going to use this to get our camera nice and straight so that we can line it up kind of perfectly perpendicular to that section. So I'm going to go into my top view here. The best way to do this is just to draw a straight line. I'm going to use the command line. I guess you could start from the center point if you want. The important thing is just to draw a straight line. Doesn't really matter how long, probably about as long as the camera is now. And then I'm going to grab the point at the point that we're looking from in the camera object and snap that to the other end here. And so now if I were to go to top view, you can see that the plane that we're looking at is perfectly horizontal. Same for, look at it from the side, it's perfectly vertical. So now all we need to do is move it into position. So I'm going to go back to where I can see my perspective view. I'm going to grab that line and those 2 points there. And I'm just going to use the move. And using my perspective view as a reference, I'm going to position it there. And what I would also like to do now is actually move it. So I'm going to use the move command again. This time I'm going to hit vertical. And I'll snap to that start point. And what I want to do is basically probably choose like an eye level perspective, either on one of the the top floor or the bottom floor. I'm going to choose kind of an eye level perspective on the top floor. I don't want to go too far. And you also, you may want to like show. You may want to have the camera pretty much centered along your section plane. In my case, or with this example, I'm trying to look down kind of both these corridors at the same time that are important in this project. So I'm just going to kind of center the camera like between those two corridors there. You can pretty clearly see both. And then the final thing we could do here is we can also go back to our perspective view, and I can type in the command perspective angle. Now, the higher I make this number, the wider my perspective angle. You can see my camera width change. You can also adjust this by moving that point there. Because I'm trying to be able to look down both these corridors at the same time, like if I were to move my point of view in here, you see it's actually blocking more of what I'm trying to see there. What I actually want is a shorter perspective angle. I'm going to lower mine to like 10 or something like that. And then I can go ahead and move this guy back out just a bit so we can still see everything. Okay, that looks good to me. And then finally, of course, I want to save it. So I'm going to go back to the perspective window, make sure that's active there. Go to the named views panel. If you don't have that open, just type in named view in the command line and it'll open. Click the little save as icon, and I'm going to label this my section perspective. Okay. All right. Looks like I'm missing. Accidentally hid some stuff here. Okay, great. So now we have our view set up, which is great. You can see, again, because we lined up that camera really nice and straight, our kind of floors should form pretty horizontal lines. Our walls should be pretty perfectly vertical lines. We'll get more to that when we get into the drawing doing the line drawing overlay. But for now, I'm going to continue on and do the render setup. So I'm going to use Vray for this rendering. Vray is not a required software. However, it is on all the lab computers at Kaplan. You can also get a free trial of it if you just Google Vray for Rhino Educational. The company that offers it is this company called Chaos Group. And you can get a free trial for 30 days if you sign up. So you can use that as well. I will caution you, I don't know that you can render full resolution with the trial version. I know it's been an issue in the past, so I don't know if that's still an issue or not. But anyway, even if you don't want to do this, you can use any of the lab computers at school and set it up that way. The other thing that I'm going to use here is if I go to kapla.arizona.edu and search for the software guidebook. I already have it open here. And then it's this link here under the software guidebook. So I'm going to use this. Here it is. Open. I'm going to use this for, in this guidebook, there's a section on setting up a rendering in Vray. So here I'm just going to go through the options, render. Yes, my view is set up. I'm using Vray. Here we go. And there's a step-by-step guide of setting up the rendering. So you can reference that if you get stuck or anything like that, but I'm going to kind of follow this as I show you how to do it in the video. So first things first, we're going to set Vray as a rendering engine. So if you don't see this at the top, Vray, that's okay. Just go to render, current renderer, and you want to choose Vray, obviously. Make sure that's selected. Once you have that selected, you should see Vray appear up here as a drop-down menu. That's when you'll know that the software is loaded. Then this is setting up and saving the view. We already did that. Okay, so we can begin the kind of settings here. So I'll go to Vray and choose Asset Editor. So I'm going to go to this gear icon, first of all. Now this is going to be most of your settings for like quality and stuff like that. I'm going to leave mine on CPU for right now, but I am going to hit interactive. And what that will do is allow us to like make changes as the image is rendering, so we can just kind of check that everything is looking correct. We're going to leave it on that for now as we do kind of draft images and set everything up. The other thing I want to do in here is going to be under render output. Now these dimensions here are the resolution that our rendering is going to come out at. And that means pixels, so 800 by 450 pixels. What I want to do first is I want to match the ratio of my viewport because I have my view set up there and that's what I want. I'm going to go under aspect ratio, click the drop down, and hit match viewport. Now I can also turn on this button, safe frame, and see that'll kind of show how it's framed so we'll know whether we're going to capture everything. But again, if you hit match viewport, you shouldn't have a problem. Then I'll click that drop down one more time and go to custom. Now you see, because we hit match viewport first, our aspect ratio is already set to more or less what our viewport is. And now every time we change the dimensions of our rendering, it should change proportionally. So we'll kind of know that we're going to render the full frame of what we're seeing in the viewport. Okay, and I'll explain later how to figure out the correct resolution for production or kind of final quality rendering. Excuse me. So the next step is to set up our lights. So what I need to do is I need to set up a Vray Son. Now I want to point out, I'm going to go in the asset editor, so this is a good place to see where what the lights are that are in your scene. I want to point out that by default you will have a Rhino Document Son. It may be on or off, and we turn it on and off by clicking this little icon. I want to click that icon and make sure it's kind of grayed out. I don't want to use the Rhino Document Son. I want to use the Vray Son because Vray will kind of interpret it differently. So we want to make sure that we use the Vray Son. In order to set it up, we'll go to the top, click Vray, Vray Lights, and go to Sunlight. Click that guy. So you'll see also, this is a little bit deceptive because the settings look exactly the same for the Rhino Son. But this is the Vray Son. So I want to make sure I have manual control unchecked. Then I'll go down to the bottom and I can search a location. So I'm going to search for Tucson. This is where our site is. And then up here, I can see two bits of information. Now, north is basically up on the y-axis. That's going to be our azimuth angle, and that's our altitude angle. So I'm just going to kind of try and choose a date and time that will give me roughly the azimuth and altitude that I want. So in my project, the sun is coming, or one important aspect of the design is how the sun kind of enters from the eastern exposure, kind of across the project. So I want an azimuth angle that's pretty east-west and a relatively low sun angle to show how the light enters kind of deep into the space. So I'm going to click OK now that I have that angle that I want. And if I click it, now I need to place that sun, basically it's basically a vector, so I'll just click somewhere in the scene. So you'll see a little arrow up here. Now that arrow is actually the direction of our sun. And if I rotate it, it will change the direction that the sun is in our scene. So we want to make sure we don't mess with that. But if we do, and if we want to adjust it, we just select that arrow, go to Properties, click on the button for light, and under Sun, click Edit. And then we'll have to go through the process again, but we can change the angle according to exactly what we wanted. For our location, I'll click OK. Oops, I accidentally changed it. And then I also want to point out that over here in the asset editor, you can see now we have another sun light source. And we want to make sure that that one is turned on. We also want to make sure that if we run into any issues with how the scene is lit, that we only have one light source, or one sunlight, I should say, turned on at a time. You can make as many as you want, but you don't want to have like a bunch turned on because you'll get, duplicate shadows and you'll get kind of weird, overexposed images and stuff like that. So I guess that's where we want it. So that sun object is turned on and the Rhino Document Son is turned off. Then I'll go back to settings. So that's one kind of step in this lighting scheme setup. The other step is to go to environment. We also need to set up kind of secondary lighting or indirect lighting. And what we're going to do is just use the position of the sun to kind of set up like a sky environment. So under environment, first I'm going to go to background. This little checkerboard icon, I want to right click, hit clear. This allows me to set up like a kind of map for the for the sky environment, and in this case that's what's going to show in the background of our rendering. If I click on that one once it's grayed out, I want to select this one at the top that's called sky. And under sun, inside the sky settings, I'll click that drop down and I want to select the one that says sunlight. Again, you should only see one of those for the one that's set up in your scene. And what that will do is it will basically make a kind of sky background environment based on the angle that our sun is positioned at. So the kind of sky is linked to the sun, which makes sense. Then we're going to expand this section environment overrides. And I want to turn on the skylight, GI, reflection, and refraction. And all I got to do is drag this sky object from the checkerboard under background into the rest of these little checkerboard options for the 3 down below. Now the GI, or the skylight, is GI stands for global illumination. Basically this means that it's going to light our scene in the way that like the atmosphere would. So it's going to use the direction of the sun and the kind of simulate the illumination that a sky environment would have to light our scene in areas that are not in direct light. And reflection and refraction are basically just going to do like our background did. It's going to show that sky environment in like things like glass, where we're looking at a reflection of the environment, or we're looking through the glass into the environment. So we're going to see the sky reflected and refracted in those materials. Okay, so that is speed with the lighting scheme. Now the last thing it will ask you, or it will tell you to do here, is to make a ground plane. Again, you know, I have this ground plane modeled in my scene, but for example, if you wanted to look at like some of the shadows that are being cast beyond your project, you can also make, you know, a larger plane. New layer, oops. And just make a really big, you know, flat plane your object, and that will make a surface on which the sun can be cast. Let's see. We're gonna click. There we go. Okay. And then we can split that. Getting duplicate surfaces there. So there we have our kind of surface to catch the shadows outside of the kind of rendered image. Right, and then the last step we'll do here is to set up a material. So in Rhino, go back to the asset editor, and to make a material, I want to go all the way over to the left to this little circle with the checkerboard. And in here, I can go to the bottom left here where the little circle with the plus and make a new material. I'm just going to choose generic. And now if I expand, I can do two things here. I can go to quick settings, and you'll see here under diffuse color, if I drag it over to the right, we're going to get something more white. If I drag it over to the left, it'll be black. I can also click in that box and set it to a particular color, or I can set like a map, which we won't do for right now. Right now I'm just going to drag it all the way to the right, and I'm going to make that material just white. And then if I go back to materialist, I can double click on that. I'm just going to call that white, and that will be a kind of generic material we're going to apply to everything in our scene. So once I've set up that material, I can close the asset editor, and I need to actually apply it to the objects in my scene. I'm going to go in my layers panel, select all the layers that have 3D geometry on them, and then over here where we have this section called material, I'm going to go ahead and click on that little circle. With them all selected, that will set the material for all these layers at once. I'll click the drop-down list, and I'll choose Use Plugin Vray for Rhino. And now I can go to Browse and choose, you know, from the materials I've created in Vray. I'll choose that one that we called white, and click OK. And you should see it update in the Layers panel. All right, and so now I believe we're ready to do a test render. I'll open up the asset editor one more time, go to the little gear icon, and what I want to do now is run a test render. Now this button up here is going to be our render, the button to start the rendering. What we want to do now, as we're doing our test render, is set up the camera. So probably most of you will see a really white scene, a really white screen when you first start rendering. That's just because the image is overexposed. So if I go under camera, under exposure, and move this little exposure slider, I believe higher numbers will make a darker image there. Okay, so also, oh yeah, I forgot one thing. So what we want to do is kind of drag it down to something like 14 where we can kind of see a clear background and a clear ground. You can see my object looks really weird for some reason. The reason is that I have not properly set up my clipping plane yet. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this rendering. I can stop it either by clicking the little teapot icon again or clicking stop in the frame buffer. I will go to the geometry tab in the Vray asset editor, and you can see I have a series of clipping planes here. Now I only have one that I really want. If I go to object, it actually says it's called a Vray clipping plane, which is surprising, but you can find out how many you have in your scene by using the command select clipping plane. You can see I have just one there. So what I want to do basically is delete these other ones. That's the one that I have in my scene. Now, Vray can recognize that and render with it, but I need to turn it off or on in my scene. I'm not sure what those other ones were doing. I guess maybe they're old ones that I've deleted. So, I could delete that object, but I can also just turn it on and off in here. So I don't need to worry too much about that. But I want to make sure I just have one clipping plane, just the one that defines my section cut there. And now let me try and hit render. So I have that little icon clicked, so it's white. It should be white. And there we go. So now when I hit render, you can see that the shadows kind of follow. Or I'm sorry, that the scene is picking up where I have my section cut placed in my object there. And I can also go in my asset editor here and click that little arrow on the right hand side to expand my options. And I believe there is a way. So under options, so you can see here, because I have a slightly tilted sun angle, it looks like I'm lighting my scene from an actual cutaway. I don't really want that, right? I just want to show it as if it were being lit, like as it will be in reality, and looking kind of inside of that picture. So in other words, if I go to options here for my clipping plane, I want to hit uncheck effect light. And I want to hit or uncheck clip light geometry. Or maybe I have to restart the rendering here. There we go. So what we're seeing in there is total darkness because there's no light reaching in there, which makes sense because right now we haven't set up any material to allow light in there. We haven't set up a glass material. So essentially, once we have our kind of lighting looking pretty good, so we want to be able to make sure that we can see what's going on in the darker areas, as well as the lighter areas are not overexposed or anything. So I think our scene is pretty well set up. I'm going to hit stop. Last thing I want to do is make a glass material. So I'm going to go back in the asset editor, click on materials, and at the bottom left I'll click add material. Again, I can choose generic. I'm going to rename this one glass. Okay, and then with this material, what I actually want to do is I'll go over to the right. So expand this little arrow if you don't see that already. And I'm going to show you how to set up other properties for materials. So before we just changed the color of the material, that's under diffuse. We don't need to mess with that at all with the glass because you'll see in a minute it won't matter. The first thing I'll do is I'll go to reflection here. Now we have a couple options here that matter. First is the reflection color. I drag it all the way to the right. So white basically means that it's fully reflective, and black means it's fully not reflective, and everything in between. So that's how I kind of control how much reflection my material has. The other option that's important here is the reflection glossiness. So if I drag that guy down, you can see my reflections become more dull. So I can produce a material that's maybe more like concrete that has a kind of dull reflective property, but not like a a really shiny reflective property. Now, because I'm doing glass, it is pretty shiny. I'm going to drag it back up to 1. And then finally, if I wanted to make it really, really reflective, maybe like a metal or something like that, I could check this option, reflection IOR. That stands for index of refraction. That's basically just another way to turn the reflection way, way up on that guy. So you can see it starts to take on the property of like a really highly reflective material, like metal. But for glass, again, I'm just going to leave that unchecked. So I want to make sure my glossiness is set to 1 and my refraction color is set all the way to white. Then I'll go next to refraction. So under these options work pretty similar. So again, I can turn that all the way to the white. And you can see now my object is translucent or transparent. Again, the refraction glossiness is how I kind of define how sharp that refractive quality is. So, you know, if I wanted to make it look sort of like frosted glass, I could turn that glossiness down or something. And then I don't want to, with glass, I really don't want to mess with the IOR at all. We'll start to make really weird kind of refractions in our materials there. So I'm going to leave that guy on 1.6 and leave the refraction, glossiness, and color set to the max. The other thing I will mention is so if we wanted to make it, like right now we just have kind of perfectly white, clear glass. If we wanted to make it a little bit blue or something like that, I could click on that little color swatch next to fog color, make it blue or something like that. Okay. And then under the fog multiplier, I could just drag that guy down. So if you wanted to make your glass have like a kind of slight blue tint, as most glass does, you could do it that way. For now, we're just going to leave it on white, especially because our rendering is only going to be in black and white anyway. Okay, and that's it. So that's how we set up glass. Now I'm going to go in here, go to my layer glazing, then I have all my kind of glass set on, and click browse and change that one to glass. Click OK. Okay. And now if I hit render, now we can see inside those spaces that were dark before, and you can also see, or we could double check again, like whether or not we have enough resolution in the really dark areas and so on. So we can kind of get a sense of how light is entering those spaces. All right. The last thing I would do once I'm happy with the material setup, once I'm happy with the lighting and kind of camera settings, I'd stop there, and I want to go back to my gear icon, and I'm going to do a production render. So I'm going to first uncheck interactive, also uncheck progressive, and I want to turn the quality here up to like high, and then I could do a rendering which wouldn't have that kind of speckly, noisy quality like before. It'll take a little longer, but it should come out nice and clean. The other thing I want to do is I want to turn up the resolution. The way that I do that, again, is I go back to render output. Now we need to do some quick math here to kind of figure out what resolution we should have. Now remember that the drawing is ½ inch equals a foot. So what I basically want to do is I want to measure roughly what the width of my kind of building is here, or the width of my image here, right at the section plane. So I could just quickly do a distance measurement, measure about the width right at the section plane there. I'm at, give or take, about 50 feet. Now 50 feet scaled ½ inch equals a foot would be 25 inches, right? So that's more or less how much this will take up on the page. ½ inch equals a foot. Now the rule of thumb for rendering is at least 150 dpi, or 150 pixels per inch resolution. So what we want to do is open up the calculator real quick. 150 dpi times 25 inches gives us about 3750 pixels. Again, we still have our aspect ratio set from before. So I'll just change the width of my image to 3750. You'll see the height automatically updates. And so now we know that we have a kind of enough resolution if we do a final rendering to kind of compose this rendering at the right scale, at 1/2 inch equals a foot. Now I also want to point out, the more, if you have like models of trees and furniture and stuff like that, just turn it off. It's really going to slow down your rendering. If you have a lot of really complex geometry, especially small stuff, like if I had a ton of these railings modeled in my scene, I would probably want to turn that off. I also want to discourage you from using like really, really, advanced like materials. The more different materials you have with like really, like highly reflective and refractive properties, again, the slower your rendering is going to be. So it's up to you how detailed you want to go with the rendering part. But again, just keep in mind this is a pretty high resolution rendering, and you're not going to want to have to wait for it a bunch of hours. All right, so that should pretty much conclude this video. So I'm gonna hit rendering after the video because it'll take probably a few minutes, and then I'll come back in the next video and continue on in the process.